Good afternoon, evening, or morning. Hello, my name is Marianne Fessenden. I serve as Academic Liaison for Agricultural Modeling and Training Systems and am your American host for the Nutritionist webinar series. Welcome and thank you for attending. These monthly webinars are intended to provide access to technical seminars on a range of topics delivered by internationally recognized speakers. The series is a unique three-language presentation held in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. Hosted by AMTS in the United States, noted ruminant nutritionists will present in English, while Marcelo Hentz Ramos from 3R Lab simultaneously translates into Portuguese for Brazil, and Paula Tirito translates into Spanish for Argentina. These seminars are held the second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. UTC or EDT in the U.S. A complete recording of archived webinars as well as the question and answer session for each will be available on the 3R Lab and the AMTS websites. There will be a post-presentation question and answer period during which listeners can submit questions through me or Marcelo and Paula. During the presentation, we will break twice to conduct audience polls, the results of which will be discussed during the question and answer period. For this, our fourth webinar, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Undersander, forage agronomist at the University of Wisconsin. Dan has conducted forage research at the Texas A&M University and Clemson University before joining the University of Wisconsin faculty as extension and research forage agronomist 22 years ago. Dan coordinates the multi-department extension forages team at the University of Wisconsin. He conducts research on grazing, forage production, and forage utilization, and on near-infrared reflectance, NIR, prediction of forage quality and other parameters. Dan has worked with farmers across North and South America and Eastern Europe. He has published over 1,300 articles and is a fellow in both the American Society of Agronomy and Crop Science Society of America. Dr. Undersander, we are very glad to have you join us. I will turn the mic over to you and enjoy your presentation.
Just go through a few comments about corn silage production. Trying to produce the most milk per hectare as we go forward, and give you a few thoughts about some of the considerations that we might keep in mind, some of the expectations that are reasonable from what we're doing. So first, let's start with a general overall principles that I will come back to at the end. But the first concept that I'd like to put forward that I'm going to spend some time on is truly that the agronomic practices mainly affect yield. The environment will have a significant impact on quality, but we have no effect on that. So what we do is mainly going to be to try to produce the highest yielding forage. Now, where management comes into play is that the largest effect on corn silage quality from a management standpoint are when we cut the corn for silage, our harvest management practices, and our storage management. Those are what will determine how much of the quality that was initially present that we can maintain in that forage through the stored feed stuff. So let's begin. First, a couple thoughts about corn silage. Corn silage is really quite a bit different than any other forage crop that we harvest because when we are talking about leaves and stems of a forage, of a grass or a legume, the leaves and stems decline in quality as the maturity advances. So the later we cut a grass or an alfalfa or a clover, the lower the quality. The same is true with corn in that the leaves and stems decline in quality with increasing maturity. On the other hand, because we have grain being formed, the overall silage quality actually increases with maturity due to the increased grain content. And these graphs below really show this point where on the left what we see is that for 2 years of data where we sampled sequentially, the digestible fiber, or the NDFD, declined continuously as that silage matured from July through late September. On the other hand, the starch content shown in the graph on the right increased as that silage matured. So we have two counteracting influences, and the unique thing about corn silage is that its quality really increases with maturity to a certain point, where every other forage that we would harvest actually decreases with advancing maturity. Now, when we look at the quality then of corn silage in this next graph, and we're expressing this as milk per ton. How many, I apologize, these are English units, but the concept will be true whether they're English or metric. What we see is that we have essentially a peak in quality of forage. The milk per ton is a quality estimate, the yellow line, and what we see is that the quality is high when the corn is pollinating, so at an early stage. The quality then falls through that August period. The yellow line goes down as we have advancing maturity because, again, we're getting more leaves and stems. And then the quality gradually increases so that the quality is highest at a recommended harvest stage. Now, if we combine the quality and the yield together, what we see in that red line at the bottom is that gradually we generally have milk per acre increasing as that quality advances. So in some cases we might end up harvesting the corn very early because of drought or because of frost in some regions, but we're going to suffer greatly on yield when we have to do that. And the maximum opportunity for us is to harvest that silage of when the grain is at the appropriate maturity so that we have a high grain content offsetting the slightly reduced quality due to the increased leaves and stems in that later maturing forage. So those are some general principles to keep in mind. All forages decline in quality with maturity, except corn silage, which actually increases in quality as the grain is formed. Now, the big thing to keep in mind, though, with corn silage is that we have a huge environmental variation on the actual quality of the final product that we're going to harvest. And so what this graph shows is the yield, the starch content, and the fiber digestibility of the same hybrid grown at, I don't know what that is, a dozen or 15 locations in one state in the same year. And what you see is that the digestible fiber varied, these blue lines. We had slightly higher digestible fiber at 2 or 3 locations. Most were average and a few were low. The overall yield ranged significantly from what we see across the locations. And then most importantly, as we look at quality, look at the range of the yellow bars or the starch content of that forage. And under some conditions, as we see here in the middle, we had a very high starch content, which is what we'd expect around 35% or so. And on the other hand, the same hybrid grown under a different environment at a different location in the same year, in some cases had less than 28% starch. So there are many advantages to corn, but it is important to remember that it has a huge environmental impact, and depending on the growing conditions on your farm and of your fields, we can have either fairly high quality forage product, or we can have a disappointingly low forage quality because we didn't get the amount of starch formation due to the environmental characteristics of that growing environment. So let's talk about some of the things that we can do, some agronomic factors affecting yield and quality of corn silage. And first, again, let's go back to the main point that the agronomic practices mainly affect yield. Now, there are a couple exceptions here, and one would be hybrid selection that you may or may not want to consider. We have a number of different types of corn and that have been marketed at various times, but frankly, we do not see that most of these benefits are important to the grower. The first thing, though, is to consider this next graph, where we're taking the average of corn hybrids grown at 4 trials here in Wisconsin in 2012. And what I want to show at each of these 4 sites is look at the difference in yield of the hybrids grown side by side in the same environment at each location. And so at site 1, you see we had a difference of almost 20 tons per hectare dry matter down to a little bit less than 15 tons, depending on which hybrid was selected. At the site 1 for the late maturing varieties, we had a little over 20-ton yield for the top and right a little over 15 or 16-ton yield for the bottom. When we go to site 2, the early types range from about 22 tons per hectare down to just a tad over 15 tons per hectare. And again, these are variety trials. They're all treated exactly the same. They're all grown side by side. The only difference is the genetic potential for yield of the different hybrids. So I would suggest when we look at these numbers that we can see a 20 or 25% difference in yield whether we select the highest yielding variety for an environment or a lesser performing variety. And that can make a significant difference here when we're generally talking about a 5-ton per hectare difference, and this would be dry matter, which would be a 15-ton per hectare silage difference at these different locations. Now, the other thing then to keep in mind is going on to this next slide, the range of parameters within a location. And what I'm showing here is when we look at yield, here are 4 locations and trials again, and what you see is that the yield, the blue bar, the range and variation was from, well, let's say 0 up to about 6,800 kilos per hectare. In the second trial, the SC late, we had almost 8,000 kilograms per hectare difference depending on the variety. So if you look at the blue bars, huge differences in yield as I showed you in the previous slide. On the other hand, when we come back and look at milk in terms of liters per metric ton, you can see the gold bar, the difference was very small. Very little difference among hybrids, conventional hybrids for forage milk per ton or forage quality. And then what we see in the dark blue bars is the milk in terms of liters per hectare, which is a combination of yield and quality. We did see, again, a slight difference in terms of milk per hectare, but not near as much as our range in forage yield. So when we're looking at corn hybrids, the conventional types, we have a huge difference in yield potential depending on adaptation of that hybrid to that environment, but we have relatively little range in forage quality among those conventional hybrids. Now, there are a few traits that have been talked about that I want to mention. I don't know if these hybrids are available in your regions or not. I'm going to mention them because they do exist. Frankly, we don't recommend any of these traits that I'm going to talk about, but just to give you a little background. We have the brown midrib hybrids, which I actually did my thesis work on almost 40 years ago now. And what you see in this picture, the leaf on the left has a brown midrib. The leaf on the right is a normal light green midrib. When we see this brown midrib in corn, it means that it has a reduced lignin content, and therefore it has a higher digestibility and a higher feed intake. No question about it. It's about 30% less lignin. It's clearly more digestible. Because it's more digestible, we have more feed intake. On the other hand, we have to really question whether or not this trait is economical, because it does have less vigor. It has slower growth early. It has reduced drought tolerance, and it has lower yield. I say on this slide 0 to 25%, but I would say that the most common is about 15 to 20% yield reduction. We think that it is generally better to plant conventional varieties to take the higher yield and to harvest at the appropriate stage than to look at these lower lignin types. The other problem with the lower lignin types is that they don't stand up as well. And if you're a little bit late in harvesting, they will lodge and fall over, which will reduce your yield to an even greater extent. So they do exist. There are some niches for them. I always tell our dairymen that if they can buy their forage by the ton, buy brown midrib, because it is a higher quality forage. If they have to grow it themselves, then grow conventional, because they can't afford to take the 15 to 25% yield loss or greater under stressful situations. So here is an example of the yield that we're looking at. The gold bars are the trial average for the corn hybrids in these trials. The blue bars are the brown midrib averages. And again, I'm going to suggest what we have generally seen is this. I said it could be close to 0, but the most common is a 15 to 20% yield reduction due to the brown midrib trait, along with the standability issues that we have. So generally speaking, the brown midribs have less lignin. They have greater feed intake. They do have the agronomic issues that I have talked about. They do generally represent an increase in milk yield, but the effect seems somewhat unpredictable, a little bit because of the growing environment that we're dealing with. And then also the last point on this slide, the benefits seem to favor the highest producing cows consuming high forage diets, and not to cows that are not at the top of their production level and or in higher concentrate diets. Another type of hybrid that has been promoted for silage is what we call the leafy hybrids. The leafy hybrids have 2 to 4 more leaves above the ear. They have increased dry matter production, so you'll generally get a little bit more tonnage per acre. But the quality improvement is a little bit iffier. The kernels are softer, which is a positive, but then we do have a smaller percentage of grain in these feedstuffs. So animal feeding trials have shown no overall advantage of feeding the leafy hybrids to lactating dairy cows. Here's an example of some of the data of the leafy varieties versus the trial average. And again, the gold bars are the trial average. The leafy types are shown at several locations where we did the testing. And generally speaking, the leafy types harvested produced a little bit higher than average yield. The exception was 209NC, where it was the same, but at all other locations we saw a little bit of a yield advantage, but then the quality advantage isn't there, and so as trials have indicated, the milk production is not there due to these leafy types. The third type of trait that has been recommended or considered for corn silage is high oil hybrids. And what this is they have a higher ratio of embryo to endosperm, and the embryo is higher in oil. Oil, of course, has more than 2 times the energy of starch. So what we're generally talking about with the high oil hybrids is greater than 6% oil. Our normal corn hybrids will run about 3.5 to maybe as much as 5% oil. Our top cross hybrids then with oil will run about 7 to 7.5%. Again, though, when we've done feeding trials with this, while there is more energy in the oil, we do not have more energy in the plant overall, and these high oil hybrids have seen no influence on milk production. Here's an example of some data from one trial where what we see when we compare a high oil to a conventional hybrid, if we look at the second line, the dry matter intake was about the same. If we look at the third line, dry matter intake in terms of kilogram per body weight was about the same. The milk yield, if we look down on the fifth line in terms of kilograms per day, was 28.1 for the high oil, 27.8 kilograms per day or liters per day for the conventional. No significant difference. When we came down and looked at fat-corrected milk in terms of kilograms per day, again, no significant difference between the high oil and the conventional hybrid. So it's a product that some people might think would be beneficial in dairy rations because oil has higher energy, but the overall content of the plant in terms of energy is not higher, and the milk production is not increased.
Thank you, Dr. Undersander. I'm going to interrupt here, and we're going to conduct the first 2 of our 4 polls. And so we'll pause the presentation a second, and I'll set up a poll. Okay, the first poll is, I look at how do I decide when to start making corn silage? I look at the crop, I have experience. B, I randomly select plants, chop, and do a dry matter to see if the plant is ready. C, I look at the kernel and begin when the milk line is 2/3 to 1/2. D, I follow the seed company's guidelines. And E, whenever my custom harvester can come to my farm. So I'll give you all a chance to answer, and then I will close the polls. I'm going to close it in 5 seconds. Okay. It takes a little while to process after the the poll has been closed. All right. The second poll, and I'll open that as I read it. What do I look for when I select my seed corn for silage? A, price, the cheaper the better. B, I look at trials in similar geographic areas and select the best 2 to 3 hybrids for milk production. C, I look for hybrids with the best grain to hectare or acre. D, I look for hybrids with a wider harvest window. Equipment is in high demand in my region. Or E, whatever hybrid produces the greatest dry matter per hectare or acre. And I'll give you 10 more seconds to compile your answers. And I'm going to close that poll. So we will return to these polls after we've completed the entire presentation, and we'll discuss them. In the meantime, we are going to, as soon as the poll closes, we'll go back to Dr. Undersander's presentation. Okay. Dr. Undersander, you can take back over.
All right. So as we look then at agronomic factors that affect corn silage yield and quality, I'd like to go down and consider 3 or 4 factors that we might vary, and then look at the impact of each on yield and quality. The first consideration is plant population. And generally speaking, forage yield increases with increased plant population up to some limit, depending on your rainfall and some other conditions. Forage quality decreases with the increased plant population, particularly above a limit. We get to a point where as we go too high in plant population, we get more and more leaves and stem and less grain, and then we don't see that forage quality improvement at the end of the season that I mentioned in the 4th slide of this talk. Therefore, the optimum may be about 4,000 plants per hectare, above that for optimum grain yield. So we want a little bit more tonnage than the optimum for grain yield, but we don't want to go too high and end up with greatly reduced grain content. And then the other last consideration is we're looking at research that's coming down and new hybrids that are being developed. It does appear that plant populations for optimum yield may be increasing. We are continually breeding corn for higher plant populations. So with the hybrids we have now, we might plant a little bit more than the hybrids that we had 10 years ago. So here is some data showing the relationship between corn silage yield and plant density. It's an average of 6 locations over about 5 years. And what you see is that our silage yield in terms of dry matter tons per hectare, we went from about 44,000 plants per hectare up to 103. And there was a continual increase, but something around 75 or 80,000 plants per hectare seems to be kind of a break point. That as we go above that, with increased seed, we get less and less dry matter yield. Additionally, as we go above that point, our grain yield goes down significantly, so our forage quality begins to decline. So generally speaking, we're thinking about something around 40,000 plants per hectare. Now here's an example of some data actually with sorghum and corn. And there's really two things that I want to point out in this table. There are places where we should be growing forage sorghum instead of corn. There's no question about it. And actually I put there's a brown midrib type of forage sorghum, which I actually helped develop about 40 years ago. And generally what we are seeing is, if we look at the brown midrib sorghum, that the NDF digestibility is about 9 to 10 points higher than for conventional sorghum. And both are considerably higher actually than corn silage. Now, when we average the corn and the sorghums together actually, and we look at different planting rates and the effect of planting rates on forage quality for each of these types, what I want to show is that when we went from the low to the medium to the high, you can see that the NDF content varied from 48.9 to 49.9. There was no significant difference. The fiber digestibility varied from 67.2 to 67.3. There was no significant difference. The net energy of lactation varied from 1.07 to 1.05, and again, no significant difference. So up to that optimum level that I was talking about, increased plant population increases yield and has no effect on quality. And then again, once we go significantly above the optimum plant population, then the quality actually does start to decline because we get less grain formation. So the next opportunity that we have for affecting yield and quality is fertilization. And there's been a lot of discussion time and again about fertilization affecting quality. And frankly, any fertilization beyond that for optimum grain yield produces no significant change in forage quality. So as we're fertilizing corn silage, we are really talking about fertilizing for optimum grain yield. Once we go above that level, additional fertilization has no effect on forage quality. The other consideration is row spacing, and we've looked at this extensively. Generally speaking, row spacing has declined as we produce more corn silage. Now that we have the variable harvesting headers on our choppers, we can do a lot of different things with row spacing. But the long and the short of it is that we do see a slight increase in yield as we go down to about 50 centimeters over wider row spacings, but we see very little change in quality. So row spacing down to about 50 centimeters will increase yield in good growing conditions, but it will generally have minimal or no effect on forage quality. The other consideration is planting date. And first let me say that generally we want to plant at a fairly early time in the spring. We want to plant a full season hybrid to take advantage of the full growing season, and then we want to use that as a tool to get our maximum tonnage. So with those thoughts in mind, and there would be some regions and maybe some of your environments in South America as you go a little further north that you might think of double cropping, but for the most part where we're thinking of a single crop, generally speaking, then delayed planting reduces yield. Planting date has really little or no effect on fiber digestibility, NDFD. Delayed planting dates tend to have lower starch content, lower milk per ton, and lower milk per acre than earlier planting dates. So what we are seeing is that as we delay planting, we get less grain fill. but our fiber digestibility does not change significantly in that corn crop. Now, one management tool that we can use to affect quality is to change the cutting height of our corn. And generally speaking, we can raise the cutter bar to increase forage quality. We'll get higher starch, we'll get higher crude protein, we'll get higher in vitro digestibility. Raising the cutter bar tends to decrease lactic acid and decrease NDF. On the other hand, the higher we cut, the more yield that we sacrifice. So, and here's an example of some data of early, medium, and late hybrids of corn cut at 3 different heights from 15 to 45 centimeters. You can see that the yield in the early went from 23 down to 21.7 tons per hectare. In the medium, it went from 17 down to 15.7. And in the late, it went from 12.5 down to 11.4. So basically, as we went from 15 to 45 centimeters, we lost something around 1 ton to 1.5 tons of dry matter per hectare. On the other hand, if we come look at NDF, it really didn't change too much. The NDF went from 59 for the early down to 59.4. For the medium, from 52.4 down to 51. So there we did see a decline of 1%. And in the late, we saw a decline of about 1%. The crude protein went up. We saw, again, lesser effect on the earlier, the shorter season types, but for the medium and the late types, we saw an increase in crude protein of about 0.5 to 1%. So as I look at farmers and advise on cutting height, my recommendation is that if you have excess supply of forage, that you raise a cutter bar height to improve your quality. If, on the other hand, you need your tonnage, then I would keep it at a recommended 10 to 15 centimeter cutting height, and take the quality that the environment and your management practices give you. Let's go on then and look at a few relationships between various components of the corn silage and the yield and quality that we get. The first graph here shows that as we increase silage or total biomass yield, if you will, the grain yield goes up. Now, there's quite a spread there, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, and this is where the variety selection becomes important. On the other hand, one of the trends that is important to recognize is that the grain yield per unit of silage has increased since 1972. So what we are seeing is that some of the old benchmarks in terms of the grain per ton or pricing corn silage are really not appropriate, because the newer hybrids have more grain per ton of silage than the older hybrids do. Now, if we look at the forage yield versus starch, again, and I apologize that these graphs are all in tons per acre, but you can about double the numbers and approximate tons per hectare. What you see is that up to about 9 tons per acre, about 18 tons per hectare, we see an increase in starch content. And then after that point, what we see is a gradual decline in starch content. And this is what I talked about earlier, where as the plant population gets too high, the grain content goes down, so the starch content declines. Now, if we look at fiber digestibility versus silage yield, and I throw this up because this is, I think, a really important thing for us to keep in mind. There's essentially no relationship. Fiber digestibility is determined by the genetics of the plant, it's determined by the environment under which it grew, and it is determined by the maturity at which you harvest that forage, but is really not in any case related to yield. Now, as we're selecting corn hybrids, then, we would recommend that we pay attention in variety trials to both yield and quality. And what we have used is milk per ton as an estimate of quality. And in this graph, that means we want to be more towards the right to get higher milk per ton of forage. And on the other hand, we want high milk per acre, which indicates high yield. And so as we look at these varieties, we run the quality, we estimate milk per ton, we estimate milk per acre and plot them, and then the varieties that are in the upper right quadrant are those varieties that had both high quality and high yield, and varieties that we should be considering planting in our forage systems for silage. Now, we do have a software program that we call Milk 2006. We're actually updating this now, but where we do estimate the milk performance of silage. And again, what we're looking at, and this is a metric system, so you see the blue boxes to the right, liters of milk per ton is a quality index, and liters of milk per acre is the quality times the yield of the silage. So here is an example where I'll just give you two examples of how we use this data. This is the same hybrid, either processed or not. And when we look at the processing, we have a little higher fiber digestibility. We had the same starch level, but the starch becomes more available. And so in this case, kernel processing generated 91 more liters of milk per ton, or about another 1,356 liters per hectare. If you look at these numbers on the far right, the 24,102 versus the 25,478, clearly processing increased forage quality, it increased milk per ton. And I'll come back and talk more about kernel processing in a minute. Just a general thought then. Let me go ahead here a second. Did we miss a couple slides out of this? I guess a couple were taken out. As we look then at the traits, we can see that generally speaking, most of the traits that we're going to look at are going to affect yield. This table shows the difference between corn for grain and corn for silage. Generally speaking, for silage, we want 5,000 to 7,500 more plants per hectare. Planting date can be about the same to a few days later. Row spacing, we do see some benefit to narrower rows, and actually a little bit more for silage than we see for grain. The response to soil fertility is crucial to higher grain yield. We do want pest resistance. As I discussed with you, the cutting height issue, we do increase quality slightly as we go higher. We decrease yield. So we have to decide what is more important to us. And in high yield situations, we might cut higher. In yield shortage situations, we might cut lower. In terms of harvest timing, I'll come back and talk about that. The key issue is really going to be the moisture content of the grain. If we harvested too high a moisture content, we're going to have sour and or moldy silage. So with that, I think we'll go to the next set of polls.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Undersander. I'm going to do that last two set of polls. This will be the final two of our 4 polls. Once again, I'll read the poll and allow for answers for 30 seconds. After I close the poll, Dr. Undersander will return to his talk. So we'll open poll number 3. And this one is, how do I process corn silage? A, we do not process. It uses too much fuel for the tractor and makes the progress slow and expensive. B, we pay the harvester extra if the grain is well processed. C, we use one-line harvester to hire a machine that can harvest is too expensive. D, we pay extra for processing. We also leave the silage in the bunk longer to improve starch digestibility. It pays off with better milk production. And E, we focus on speed, not processing. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer, and then I'm going to close this poll. While that processes, we'll get ready for the next poll. Okay, the final poll of our 4 polls is about silage density. I'm opening the poll now. And how do we measure silo density? A, I use the UW spreadsheet to calculate silage density. B, we calculate the density from the number of loads, weight of loads, and volume of silo. C, I have a heavy tractor, my density is okay. D, as long as I have a hard time taking a sample from the face of the bunk, the density is okay. And E, I do not worry about density, I feed out fast. So we'll give you another couple of seconds to answer, and I'll close this poll. At the end of Dr. Undersander's presentation, we'll have a question and answer period, during which time Marcelo, Tom, and Dr. Undersander will discuss the poll results. As soon as this finishes processing, we'll turn the talk back over to Dr. Undersander to finish up. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So what I've kind of stressed up to this point is that most of the agronomic considerations that we would make affect yield. There are some trends with quality, but those are much more environmentally related. But let's talk then about what we can do to affect quality. And the first and most important thing is to harvest when the whole plant is at 60 to 65% moisture. Now, the reason that we pick that is that as we go higher in moisture content, we will get poor quality fermentation. In fact, we can get butyric acid, we can get Clostridia, both of which reduce feed intake significantly. As we go much drier than that, packing becomes an issue. So our recommended moisture content is 60 to 65% moisture. Now, how can we tell when we have the right moisture content? Well, one system is inline moisture sensors. And here is one company that makes an NIR unit that mounts on a chute that measures the moisture content of the silage that is being chopped. There are other companies now besides the green choppers that have inline moisture sensors. They do cost a significant amount of money, but they really do work, and for large operations might be a valuable asset. For many other farmers, the consideration that we would use is to harvest by the milk line. And the situation is that the milk line moves from the outer edge towards the inner portion of the kernel. And when we see this milk line be half to 2/3 of the way down, then generally speaking, the whole plant is in that 60 to 65% moisture range. There is some varietal difference. We need to use this with a little grain of salt, but it is a good indicator as to when we might consider harvesting. One of the ways we frankly use this is to consider that when we're at the half milk line, maybe that's when we should take a sample and test for moisture with some kind of moisture testing device. But in the absence of a moisture testing device, we sometimes have to go by the milk line itself, and it is a guideline that will generally put us in the right ballpark. Now, one of the other things to think about in silage making is chop length. And our recommendation is, I said 1.9, but roughly 2 centimeters theoretical length of cut, and with the silage processed at 1 millimeter. Now, along with that, if you look in this pile of silage here, we want 15 to 20% of the particles to be greater than 2.5 centimeters. So we want our average length of cut to be around 2 centimeters. We want processing at 1 millimeter with a significant portion longer. The reason that we have these kinds of guidelines are we can chop it finer. There's no question about it. But we're doing two things when we do that. First, we're increasing the cost of chopping. The finer we chop it, the more fuel it takes, and the higher the price per ton of that forage. So we want to chop to the minimum length we can. The other thing is as we chop finer, we do reduce the effective fiber, and that's why we want that 15 to 20% actually to be longer than 2.5 centimeters, so that we can have some good scratch influence of that silage within the rumen. Now, one of the things that we really want to think about is the processing. When we are harvesting at half to 2/3 milk line, those kernels are relatively hard. If we do not process, as is shown in this picture, and crack every kernel open, the kernels that are not cracked open will tend to pass right through the cow, and you have lost that source of energy and starch to the cow. So one of the things that we can do is to watch the manure of our cattle, and if we see whole kernels in there, we know we should have done something different when we made that silage. We have to be a little bit careful with processing because, frankly, it takes less horsepower and it goes faster if we process less, but you clearly want the kernels broken. One of the simplest tests that we use for looking at the effectiveness of the processing, and again, the main influence of processing is to break the kernels, is to take a handful of the silage, put it in a bucket of water, shake it around a little bit, and then the leaves and stems will float. We scrape those off, we pour out, and then you can look at your kernels very carefully and make sure that all of the kernels are cracked. I'd really recommend that you do this when you start chopping in the field. And if you don't see that all the kernels are being cracked, you should chop that or stop that chopper and readjust the processing unit on it. This is one of the key issues that we run into, is the degree of processing. This may be chopped a little bit too fine, but this is wonderfully processed corn silage with lots of grain in it. And so generally, again, let's go back. Here's some good corn silage. We're looking at a chop length. This happens to be actually some of the shredlage that we're looking at now, where we have increased our particle size. But what we are doing, if you notice, there are no entire pieces of stalk in here. Because we have the two wheels rotating at different speeds, we are stripping apart those pieces of stem, and so we are creating smaller pieces that are longer, so we still have our effective fiber. We are cracking the kernels as we see here, but we are having a little longer fiber length than simply chopping with a processor. So this is a third process that we're evaluating. It does look like there might be some benefit to this. It is another expensive attachment to the chopper, but worthy of consideration, going to a longer length and shredding the stems in addition to processing the kernels. So the other thing to think about is when we're looking at the corn silage, we want to minimize the respiratory losses. When we cut that corn, those leaves and stems continue to respire, they continue to break down the starches and sugars, and they give off dry matter. So you are losing dry matter, and of course you're losing starches and sugars, which are where your energy is. So our recommendation is to pack that silage, is to fill the silage rapidly, preferably within 24 hours, but maybe 2 days. If you have a bigger bunker, maybe that's one advantage why we don't want bunkers to be too big. But the other alternative is if it's a long bunker, you might pack on a wedge at an angle and cover the back half and keep filling from the front. But the main thing is to pack to a high density. We want 710 to 720 kilograms per cubic meter of silage. Now that may sound like a lot, but I think it's important to recognize that even when we pack the silage that tight, we still have 40% open pores or airspace in that silage. As we pack less densely, we have more airspace, we have more respiration, and therefore more starch loss. And then the other thing is that when we begin to feed out, because we have more airspace with less densely packed silage, the air penetrates back in from the face, and it causes the silage to begin to heat. One of the things that we should always keep in mind is that when our silage heats, that means we have energy loss, that means we have quality loss, so we want to minimize that. So again, in packing, we want to do it rapidly, we want to do it high. Our principle is to exclude oxygen. We want lactic acid producing bacteria to be stimulated, and we want other molds and yeast to be inhibited. One of the things that we see is that the more rapidly we can reduce the pH, the less dry matter, the less forage quality loss we have. And that, in fact, is why we see a benefit to adding the lactic acid producing bacteria as an inoculant. It should be at the chopper. It should, because we want good coverage. If you're going to simply spray it on at the bunker, I would save the money. It's not worth it, because if you don't get good coverage, the inoculant is not beneficial. So do keep in mind that we want to minimize the respiratory loss, that we want lactic acid production, that requires the proper dry matter. It requires anaerobic conditions. It requires the bacteria that ferment the sugars and produce the acid, and then it requires sufficient starch and sugars for those bacteria. Now the last point is seldom an issue with corn. We generally have more than adequate levels of starch, and so the last point is not an issue there. It can be an issue for making silage from mature grasses particularly, or even alfalfa, but never for corn silage. So again, the important thing is to come back and pack that silage well. And here what I'm showing is twofold. One is a bunch of big tractors to do it. But the other is I want you to notice in the upper right-hand corner that John Deere tractor has a big cement block attached to the 3-point hitch. We're adding weight to the tractor by adding a tonnage of a block. If you look at the yellow-green tractor in the lower left, we again see a weight on the back of that tractor. We want as much weight as possible on those tractors when we are packing. The other thing we need to think about is the amount of time that those tractors are running. And so here is an example of this spreadsheet that we have that can help you calculate your density, model whether or not you have a good practice for filling your bunker. The idea would be that you plug in the bunker silo wall height, in this case 2.7 meters. You plug in the maximum silage height, in this case 3.34 meters. We plug in the rate at which the silage is coming to the silo. That's as the silage is made at roughly, in this case, 65% moisture, 35% dry matter. We're bringing in 50 tons per hour. This is going to be slow for some of you. This is going to be an appropriate range for others. The moisture content. And then the other major factor that you control in packing density is how thick of a layer you're packing. It's very crucial that you think about the thickness of the layer that you're packing. The thinner you pack, the more dense your silage will be. And then down below you plug in your tractors, the weight of the tractors, and the percent time that they're running. And this can be crucial in many areas. As I've talked to people about filling their silos around the world, one of the things that I see is I'll tell them, well, they got to keep those packing tractors running 100% of the time. And the answer is always, oh, yes, we do. And then a number of times I've taken the farm manager, we've gone around out of sight, and not too long after the manager's gone, you can hear the tractor shut down. So packing time is a crucial thing. The thing that I want to point to you is that under these conditions, and you can download this spreadsheet and change it to match your own, but just to give you a benchmark, silage coming in at 50 tons an hour, packing 13 centimeters, 2 tractors, one at 11,000 kilos, the other at 9, running 100% of the time. Under those conditions, we are just barely getting the density of 7.07 kilograms of silage per cubic meter. So if we brought it in faster at this condition, we would not be getting the density. We'd need to add heavier tractors. We'd need to make some other changes here. And then again, at this point, our porosity is 40%. So under these conditions, this grower, we would expect to get that 710 roughly kilograms per cubic meter, but we'd still have our 40% porosity. That's the goal that we're shooting for. We don't want more porosity, more airspace than 40%. I'll just got a couple quick pictures here at the end. Here are some infrared pictures of bunkers. You can see how they start to heat. The red indicates heating. In the upper left, we had less packing across the top. In the middle, we had less packing on the lower left, and that silage heated as it was being fed out. And then in the lower left bunker, you saw one spot that wasn't packed too well in the middle of the bunker on the left side. Right side, excuse me. The last thing then is face management. We want to be sure to manage our face to keep it straight. We want to use a tool that we're removing silage from the top down, never a bunker to lift up, and which then creates a break and lets air into the face of that silage. So face management is a crucial thing. In summary then, what we're looking at is from a production management, there are differences among corn hybrids for yield and quality, but mainly we're going to be focusing on yield with those that we think are most beneficial. Plant population, row spacing, and fertilization primarily affect yield. And then the major influence that you have on the quality of your corn silage is the maturity of cutting, your harvest practices in terms of processing versus not, and then your storage and feed out management of that silo. And that ends the comments that I'd wanted to make in this presentation, so we can proceed as you wish.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Undersander. That was a terrific presentation. Before I open the floor for questions, I want to invite our listeners to attend the next webinar to be held on the 10th of June at 6 p.m. UTC or Eastern Daylight Time. The presenter will be Dr. Noelia Silva Del Rio, a veterinarian who serves as an assistant specialist in cooperative extension at the Veterinary Medicine Teaching and Research Center in Tulare, California, where she is responsible for the nutritional management education for the Central Valley dairy herds. Her talks will focus on feed analysis and what role it plays in trying to get the diet of the cows close to what the cows are eating. Save the date and time, Wednesday, June 10th at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time or UTC-4. Before we start with the question and answer period, and if you have questions, please raise your hand in the English language version or type it in the question Q&A section, and I will acknowledge you and read off the question, or we'll see if we can have you speak. Doesn't always work, so we'll go ahead and see what works best for that. Marcelo and Paula will be fielding the questions for Brazil and Argentina. We want to remind you to come back each month on the second Wednesday for an informative new speaker. I would like to thank the people who made this possible: Tom Taluki at AMTS USA and Global, Marcelo Hens Ramos at 3R Lab in Brazil, and Paula Torillo in Argentina. Our translators at each location are essential: Isabella in Brazil and Ezequiel in Argentina. We also want to thank the sponsor for our English language seminar, Ajinomoto Heartland Incorporated, makers of AgiPro L-Rumen protected lysine, and Virtus Nutrition, manufacturers of Energy 2, Prequel, and Strata. Archived presentations are available at our website. We will start with some questions. After a few, we will take a break from the audience questions to present the poll results. For listeners in the English language webinar, unless you're certain your audio is working, we ask that you type your question in the Q&A window to avoid instances where the question cannot be heard by all listeners. I will read the questions and identify the questioner. Marcelo and Paula will ask questions for Brazil and Argentina. I will start with a question from Marcelo. So I'm going to unmute Marcelo's mic, and he will have the first question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent job, Dr. Undersander. First question here: how many seeds per bag usually you have in a bag of corn per corn silage in the United States? Because in Brazil we have around 60,000, I think is correct, and we usually use 1 bag per hectare. And I think you show some data that maybe a little bit more seeds per hectare would be better.
Yes, that's correct. We have some variation. Many of our bags have around 80,000 seeds in them, but that's all right. You can adjust as long as you know what your seed count is and how much you're planting per hectare. We would suggest that with the newer hybrids where we have good moisture and good yield potential, that we are seeing a response from you suggested 60,000 seeds, but we might want to be up in that 70 or 75,000 seeds per hectare.
Excellent. Thank you.
Marcelo, do you have a follow-up question? I don't have any questions here in the U.S. side
yes.
yet.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I'm going to leave you open for a little while.
Okay. On that slide that you showed the sorghum experiment, you have low, medium, and high, I think, population You show one slide there. They want to know what's low, what's medium, and what was high population on that slide.
I'll have to go back and get that to you. I averaged across the corn and the sorghum, and we had different plant populations for the two. So let's see. I'll have to go back and check the reference. I don't know what it is right off the top of my head, Marcelo.
Okay, thank you.
Marcelo, keep going if you have more questions.
Okay. The third one, how many seeds do you recommend per linear meter, and what is the space between lines, like the row space for corn silage?
Well, we're generally the seeds per linear meter will depend on what your row spacing is. We think that the geometry is such that we should count the plants per hectare and not plants per row. What we are seeing is a slight yield advantage as we go down. I think I said this in one of the slides, to about 25 or 30 centimeter row spacings. We'll see maybe a 5% yield increase over wider row spacings. So I'd have to go back and do the calculation, but again, my recommendation would be 75,000 seeds per hectare with 25 to 30 centimeter row spacings.
Okay. I think one of the slides you show when you process corn silage, we usually see an increase in starch digestibility, but I think you saw improving NDF digestibility too?
I showed an improvement in what, NDF?
Yeah, I think like usually we see when we process, you mean crushing and cutting the seed, correct?
Right.
Like the grain.
Well, yeah, but when we process, we also do strip apart some of those chunks of stem with a standard processing, and more so with the shredlage that we're now talking about. And so we do see oftentimes an increase in fiber digestibility with processing, simply because we have shredded the stalks a little bit more and the microbes can penetrate better to digest the fiber. So we see both.
A greater KPS would also, greater KPS would also mean an increase in NDF digestibility?
Oftentimes, that's correct. Not always, but oftentimes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Can I keep going, Marion?
Yeah, go ahead, Marcelo. We don't have any questions here on this end yet, and I know that Paula has been having some difficulties. So if Paula texts me and says she's ready for some questions, I'll let her go ahead. But in the meantime, Marcelo, just keep going. You're doing very, very well. Thank you.
Asking good questions, too.
The Brazilians are hungry for information. One more here. When you travel to the United States to visit dairy farms, you usually see those big silos that don't have any walls. And is that the way we're going now?
Some parts of big silos without walls, I presume you mean what we would call a silage pile. Is that correct?
I think they're trying to be there. Yeah, I think they're trying to compare with maybe with California, those big pile of silage where you just compact that and put some plastic on top. Yeah.
So some parts of the world use piles, and some parts of the U.S. If the pile is made well, the basic difference between a pile and a bunker is that it takes more land for the pile than it does for the bunker. So most of our farmers put up walls and pack it. so that we take less acreage for the silage storage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but both can have excellent density if done well.
They do, that's correct.
Okay.
Okay, Marcelo, I do have a question here from the U.S. This is Patrick Baird, and he asks, how far away are we from seeing results of shredlage studies?
We're gradually running a few. The first couple shredlage trials have been somewhat neutral. We haven't seen great benefit. We have completed 2 more trials, and we are seeing some benefit. So I would have to say that at this point it's still a little bit up in the air. It's an expensive piece of machinery. It takes more horsepower, and we're not always seeing the quality benefit. But as we're learning to manage better, we may see some changes in the future. So short answer is we're evaluating another set of trials. We'll have some stories for you by this fall.
Thank you. Marcelo, do you have follow-up questions?
Yep. Can I keep going?
Yes, please.
That's a question that they make to me a lot of times, and I want to hear your opinion. Can I send a sample when I'm cutting the whole plant to make silage, and compare to the sample when I open the silage? What's going to be the biggest difference, or it should be very close to the lab, to the forage lab?
There will actually be some difference between a fresh material and material that has been fermented for 3 to 6 months. The first thing is if we have no liquid running out, that's a good thing. Then we have not lost protein and we have not lost starch and sugars. So the major change is if we do not have any liquid loss or leachate from the pile or bunker, is that the protein becomes a little bit more digestible over time. The zein protein in corn kernels is difficult to digest, but after sitting in acid for some months, it does become more available. So we see theoretically no change in crude protein. We see no change in total fiber. We see little to no change in fiber digestibility, but we do see that the protein becomes more digestible and available over time.
Do you see any change in starch? And I think there is a follow-up on that. Do bacteria use starch to ferment?
Yeah.
Or only sugar?
So we will oftentimes see starch decline because that's the substrate that is being used to produce the acid. So we'll see starch go down and acid content go up.
Excellent.
Good comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcelo, do you have more questions?
3 more.
Okay, keep going. And then just let me interrupt for a second, Marcelo. Let me know when you're ready to do the polls, because the rest of us are.
We are ready.
Okay. Do you want to do the polls now, or do you want to ask more questions?
Maybe 1 or 2, and then we can go to the polls.
Okay.
Maybe 1 more. I think that's important. And Dr. Undersander, it's a tough one for you. When should I use inoculant for corn silage and for grass silage, and if I should use? So some comments on that.
Actually, it's not so difficult. What we are seeing is in all the trials that have been done with inoculants on corn silage, we see a benefit something around 50% of the time. We think that that's enough of a positive response for the price of inoculants, at least in the United States, to justify always using silage inoculants for corn. We'd recommend the Lactobacillus plantarum. There's been some discussion about Buchneri. Buchnerai is more expensive. Buchnerai has some less efficiency, so you lose energy. We do not recommend Buchnerai unless the person isn't going to pack the silage density, and then they're going to have increased fermentation problems and heating on feed out. So as long as they pack it well, the Lactobacillus plantarum is adequate, it's more efficient, and it's less expensive. If they're not going to pack it well, then I recommend Buchnerai, which is more expensive and you have some efficiency loss. On grass silage, we always recommend Lactobacillus plantarum.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you, Marcelo. Paula has a few questions that she's going to ask. Go ahead, Paula.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for your presentation. It was great. The first question is from Horacio. This year, I've chopped at 17 millimeters and I've got a 90% on the top sieve. What do you think about it?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again, please?
Yes. This year, I've chopped at 17 millimeters.
Oh, chopped at 17 millimeters, okay.
Yes, and I've got a 19% on the top sieve of the shaker box. What do you think about it?
17 millimeters. I think 19% on the top is a good number. Let's start with that, because we do want that. Remember, I said roughly 20%. We want to be the 2 centimeters or longer, which is generally the top screen. So I think you're processing very well.
Paula, do you have another question you'd like to ask?
Yes, I have another question from Leonardo. He is asking what happened with the milk line on Stay Green hybrids.
What happens with the milk line on Stay Green hybrids? That's actually a very good question. What we find is that the senescence and the moisture content are not very strongly related. A Stay Green is one where the leaves don't die as rapidly. There will be a little bit of change, and this is some of this hybrid variation that we see with milk line, but still, again, I would recommend that at least we start at half milk line, check for moisture content. If you don't have moisture checking capabilities, then I would certainly harvest at least at 2/3 milk line, whether it's Stay Green or regular.
Thank you. Paula and Marcelo, I think now we can go and discuss the polls if everybody is ready. So I'll unmute you, Marcelo, as well. Okay. There are the results for poll number 1. As you can see, the question was, how do I decide when to start making corn silage? And the answer A, which had no respondents, I look at the crop, I have experience. The answer for B, the U.S., and that was, the U.S. answered the second most with B. I randomly select plants, chop, and do a dry matter to see if the plant's ready. Marcelo, why don't you go ahead and start addressing these results if you'd like.
Marianne, yes. I'm not seeing the graph come up.
Let me take back here. Let me see if this helps. Okay.
There we go.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you for helping me with that. Okay. Marcelo and Dr. Undersander, would you like to discuss those results a little?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I'm very happy with the Brazilians, the Americans, and Argentine nutritionists because I think in my opinion, they're hitting B and C, which is the right way to be because they're looking for a certain dry matter of the whole plant. They're trying to use some markers, which is the corn milk line, but they know it's not exactly perfect, so they try to take some samples and do the dry matter. And we know it's very sad for all of us that some people don't have the machine to harvest, so they have to harvest when the machine is around. But most people were very good.
I agree. I'm really impressed with the results here. I think overall B and C are the best choices. I'm pleased to see as many people actually checking moisture because if we don't have an alternative, use the milk line. But for us, we generally think of milk line as a method of determining when to begin taking plants to do a moisture test. But very good.
Okay, should we move on to the results for poll 2?
Yep.
Okay, there you go. Go ahead, Marcelo.
Okay, let's see here. Oh, nice. People really look for, I think Dr. Undersander can come with that better, but we expect to see more and more universities and state research centers to do more of these experiments to generate 2 or 3 hybrids that are better for that region. There still have some decent amount of people that look for high dry matter per hectare, and I think Dr. Undersander can comment on that. And you still have a lot of them that I know in Brazil, the number C, where we're looking for more grain. And I think the work we're doing here, we're trying to educate people to look for milk per hectare.
Yeah, I think that's right. Grain is an indicator, but it's I would suggest when we're looking for high grain yield, we're only about 60 or 70% as accurate as if we're looking for high milk yield because the cattle are eating both the leaves and the stem, so the grain is just one component of what they're eating, and it's less than half of it. But
now,
not bad.
Dr. Undersander, can you comment a little bit on that window to cut? Because I know some people are taking account that because of the machine and rain, that kind of stuff.
I'm sorry, you went quiet there on me, Marcelo.
The window to cut, how many days I can wait to harvest for corn silage? Because sometimes it's raining, or the machine is not around, or stuff break. So people like to select hybrid to a wider window to make corn silage.
Well, we haven't really seen much difference in dry down rate among the hybrids, so obviously there's some comment about that in Argentina because that's not being considered in either Brazil or the U.S. From the studies we have done, we see that with average weather conditions, the kernel dries about the corn dries about 0.5% a day. So if you do a moisture test and you're at 68, you know that you're about 6 days away from harvesting. We see that the dry down rates are very consistent as long as the weather is constant.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to poll 3. Okay.
Well, I like the D answer because they pay for better work when the people are going to harvest. So if they do a good job processing the kernel, the farmers pay a little bit more. That's, in my opinion, is excellent. I think the United States and Argentina are doing a better job than Brazil now, but we will catch up. One problem that we have, Dr. Undersander, Most people only have the machine that will harvest with one line, and there's no processing. So I know a lot of them are trying to harvest a little bit wet because they can maybe hit a little bit the kernel. Maybe you want to comment about that.
Well, rather than harvest wet, where you have some leaching and the potential of bad fermentation, I would suggest that you chop a little finer if you don't have a processor on there. In fact, our recommendation, if you remember, I said 1.9 to 2 centimeters for processing. We might back down to as little as 1 centimeter if we're not processing. So the trade-off is with a processor, we can chop longer lengths. Without a processor, we simply have to chop finer to break those kernels.
Excellent.
Okay, and we'll move to a discussion of the final poll. Here is poll 4. Go ahead, Marcelo.
Okay, let me see here. Well, please, Dr. Undersander, comment on option C, because a lot of times we think we have the tractors are heavy, but they're not. And in the end, we end up losing a lot of nutrients because we not pack well. So I don't like people selecting number C here. If they think the tractor is heavy, my guess is okay.
Yeah, you know, both the U.S. and Brazil had, 30 and 40% roughly select C. Marcelo, we have some missionary work to do. Because a heavy tractor is good, but it might not be enough depending on how fast the silage is coming in. So if you saw those pictures, I was using 2 and sometimes 3 heavy tractors instead of 1. What really counts is the end product in terms of density, and that relates to the weight of the tractor, the thickness of the layer, and the rate at which the silage is coming into the silo primarily. So the tractor weight is just one of 3 components and can mislead us.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you, Marcelo, and thank you, Dr. Undersander. Marcelo, you do such a good job discussing these polls. We will go back to answer any questions that people may have. Paula, if we're going to start, Marcelo, do you have any questions from the Brazil side?
Let me check here. Wait for a little bit.
Okay, I know that Paula does, so while you check, I'm going to let Paula speak. Okay, go ahead, Paula.
Yes. A question from Emilio. Can we get the same milk yields per ton of dry matter using forage sorghum silage, BMR, mixed with wet grain, with wet corn?
There's a whole bunch of things you said there, and I would say some points are okay and some are not. BMR sorghum silage is a fine product by itself and can be adequate. Now, is this a sorghum or a sorghum Sudan grass? Was there grain on the sorghum? Can you tell me?
Not sorghum. It's forage sorghum.
Yeah, which has grain head. I do not recommend mixing grain in with the silage. I recommend with the forage sorghum, if we harvested it at 60 to 65% maturity, it makes excellent silage. It's more than adequate for high quality forage for dairy cattle, and we're actually starting to see more use of this in the southern United States, which are warmer and sometimes have water issues where sorghum is more drought tolerant and heat tolerant than the corn is. So I would look at them as being an environmental choice. I would not consider mixing with grain. I don't think mixing is generally a good process. Simply harvest at the appropriate moisture and put up a good quality silage by itself, and then mix the grain in the ration as necessary when feeding.
Okay, thank you, Paula. Paula, I know you're having trouble connecting, so do you have more questions while you're still here?
Okay, I have one.
Go ahead.
It is from Sebastian. He's asking, which is your opinion about the film covering the silage, the oxygen barrier?
So I'm not sure. That's a fairly broad way to ask the question. We are seeing a benefit. There are actually now silage covers that are, first off, the plastic is important. Some leak air. We do recommend a thick enough plastic to keep the air out. We do recommend covering it with sandbags or tubes so that it doesn't blow in the wind. We actually are testing and have seen favorable from a dual layered film. It's a little more work to put on, but we're saving more silage underneath, and at least for us, as the value of the silage is increased, we think it's worthwhile. So without more information from you, all I can say is there definitely is a difference. We prefer the thicker, we prefer the more airtight, and we actually prefer a dual layer covering.
Okay, Paula, go ahead with another question.
Yes, here's another question about from Sebastian. In Argentina, the values of crude protein vary between 7 and 9%. Why do you think we have different results from you?
I'm having a little problem understanding that. Can you repeat the question for me again, please? What's 7.9%?
Yes. Here, Sebastian is saying that our protein values is between 7 and 9%, and he has seen different values from your results.
Oh, so our variation in protein content of corn silage runs from 7 to 9, and all I can tell you is that depends a little bit on the fertility. If you had adequate nitrogen, it'll be higher in crude protein. It also depends on the environment under which it grew, and a little bit on the tonnage. The higher the yield, the lower the protein. So 7.9 is a good number. If I were on the 7 end, I'd think I was a little low. 9 is wonderful. So if you're right around 7.9 is close to 8. If you're at 8, that's pretty good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Paula, are you finished with your questions?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. And Marcelo, he has no questions, and I have no questions here on my side. So I want to, again, thank you, Dr. Undersander, for such a timely and useful talk. We're really glad everyone who joined us could join us, and I know it was a struggle this time for Paula. She had some surprises at the end, or right before, that she couldn't connect. I've unmuted Marcelo and Paula. They can go ahead and say goodbye to Dr. Undersander. Okay.
Go ahead, Marcelo.
Okay. Thank you all, Dr. Undersander. Thank you so much. The MTS team, Paula, 3R Lab, everybody involved. Thank you all, everybody that participated. Now we have to spread the word and make it happen in the field. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Marcelo.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Paula.
Yes, I want to thank you for your patience. We had a lot of troubles today. We will try to fix it for the next time. Thank you, Dan, Tom, Marcelo, and Marian, of course.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Undersander. I think it went pretty well, and thank everybody for attending. We will see you next month. Thanks and goodbye.
Goodbye.